Grant, Almighty God, that the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart may prove acceptable in your sight. Come, Lord Jesus. Let us preach together. Amen. Please be seated. Well, I'm delighted to be back among you again, and I'm delighted to have this marvelous parable to talk about, the parable of the owner of the vineyard who sends laborers into the field. It's kind of a vexing parable. You know, my mother's favorite word was vexatious. She used to use the word vexatious all the time. I didn't know what it meant, but I got nervous about it because she used it a lot when I was around. So I asked her what it meant, and she said vexatious means a little bit frustrating, a little bit irritating, a little bit hard to figure out. Well, there's something vexatious about this parable because it's built on the assumption that working in the vineyard should receive the largest amount of compensation. The vexation is the wall or an unwarranted assumption. Their assumption is that they who were there the longest should receive the most pay. And we know somewhere that we sort of side with the gracious and the generous landowner. We love him. He's wonderful. He gives everybody of his bounty. He gives everybody the same. And we like that, but it's a little bit unusual for us. We're somewhere deep inside. We feel a little bit the way many people feel when they hear the parable of the prodigal son. The prodigal son comes home, and he's a ring on his finger and a cloak over his shoulders, and they throw a great feast. And who comes up but the older brother, who has been faithful, who has been loyal, who hasn't squandered any of the family money, and he's furious. And you know, many people, me included, I sort of can see where the older brother is coming from. And that's the vexatious part of this. It's built on assumptions, which are good assumptions. And yet Jesus wants to turn those assumptions upside down. That's what this parable is about. The normal assumptions that we have living in the real world, living in the world of competition, living in the world of a day's pay for a day's labor. We live in that world, and Jesus wants to move us from that world, from that kingdom, into the kingdom of grace, the kingdom of love, the kingdom which doesn't. It's a difficult journey that Jesus is asking us to make. We need to live by assumptions. We wouldn't be able to drive automobiles if we didn't make assumptions about the other drivers. We assume they're going to stop at stop signs. We assume they're going to stop at red lights. That might not be a good assumption to make in Philadelphia, or Boston especially. But in general, we have to make assumptions that other people will do what they're supposed to do, or else we will in a society of strangers, which, let's face it, that's where we live. We live in a society of strangers, and we can't do it unless we make certain assumptions about how they're going to behave, what they're going to do. So we begin there. But Jesus reminds us that these assumptions can blind us. These assumptions can prevent us from seeing other alternatives. And that's really what this parable is about. It's a different world, a different set of circumstances, a different possibility. Not the possibility of competition, who can get in the most hours, who has the best qualification, who went to the best schools, who has the best resume. No, a different kind of world where all receive God's grace abundantly, where all receive God's love without qualification, without distinction. It's a different kind of world. And that's the world which this parable invites us into. And it can only do it if it takes our assumptions and tips them on their head. Most jokes do the same thing. Whenever you hear a joke, you're hearing a story that has an unexpected ending, where your assumptions going into the story are turned upside down. I'll give you an example. How many of you know the great Joseph of Arimathea joke? That's a thigh slapper. Joseph of Arimathea comes home. My wife knows this. She's heard this 100 times. Joseph of Arimathea comes home, and he's all excited. He said, "Oh, how are you, dear?" She says, "Fine. How was your day?" He says, "Oh, I met Jesus of Nazareth." "Oh, the prophet." "Yes, I met him. And I told him he could use our tomb." And his wife looks at him and says, "What in the world are you doing, letting him use our tomb? That tomb is for you and for me and our children and our family for many generations. Why are you letting him use our tomb, our brand new tomb?" And she's getting madder and madder. And finally, Joseph of Arimathea says, wait, relax. He only needs it for the weekend. What's happened in that story is your expectations, your assumptions have been turned upside down by the punchline of the joke. So a parable in some ways is God's punchline. God showing us something unexpected but wonderful. And if our assumptions get in the way, we can't see it. That's what's happened in this story. The assumptions of those laboring all day got in the way. They couldn't see the profound generosity of the vineyard owner. They couldn't give thanks to the God of enough, the God who has enough love, enough grace, enough mercy, enough compassion to receive us and to love us and to embrace us, no matter what we've done. Humankind would be lost unless we had a God of infinite mercy and forgiveness and the capacity to let go of what we've done and keep trying to draw us to himself. Humankind would have perished centuries ago if God was not of that nature. In the great prayer of humble access, we confess we are not worthy so much as to gather up the crumbs under the Lord's table. And then we say, "But thou art the same Lord whose property is always to have mercy." And those are great words of freedom. In the whole prayer book, there are few prayers that so emblazon and embolden the freedom that we have, the freedom to foul up, the freedom to strike out, the freedom to make mistakes, the freedom to be unworthy. Because God's nature, God's property, is always to have mercy. And so God will draw us up, pick us up. And that's the good news of the parable. But those grumbling have lost it. They've lost the sense of that. The other thing that happens is that this parable reminds us that we have time. We have time enough. Now, I don't know if you're like me. I hope you're not. But I look back on my life and I regret. The older I get, the more I regret time that I've wasted, time that I've squandered, time that I could have seen and enjoyed and relished the beautiful things that were happening when I was younger. But I was too busy thinking about what's coming up, thinking about getting a date for the prom, thinking about whatever, to really, really enjoy. And now I'm discovering that in my dotage, there's still time. And that's what this parable is ultimately about. There's time. You don't have to be there at the crack of dawn. You have to be the first one in line. They're not going to run out of whatever it is you're dying to get. God has time for us, whether we come to him at the first hour or the 11th hour. The power and presence of God is available to us. That's the best news in this parable. But the parable also has a warning. Because assumptions, there's an old saying about an assumption. And you know what it is. I'm not going to say that one. But when I was in social work school, we used to say that an assumption is a resentment waiting to be born. An assumption is a resentment waiting to be born. Because most assumptions, or a lot of assumptions, don't come to pass. And then there arises resentment. And then there arises envy. And then there arises hatred. And we become like Iago in Shakespeare's great tragedy Othello. The good fortune of Othello and Desdemona and Cassio, the good fortune that they had were a knife to Iago. It reminded him of all that he had missed out on. And so he was filled with hatred. That's the warning of this passage. That's the warning of this parable. Now, you'll be interested to know that the second to last line in the parable, which we have translated, the New Revised Standard translated as, "Are you envious because I am generous?" In the original Greek, if you read the King James Bible, it will say, "Are your eyes evil because I am good?" Because literally, it has to do with the evil eye. How do you see things? Do you see things through God's eyes, loving eyes, caring eyes, or do you see the world through evil eyes? Now, we don't talk much anymore about evil eyes, and that's one of the reasons they changed it. We don't, evil eye. When I hear evil eye, what I think of is when I was in college, we used to give the evil eye to the guys on the other team, So they'll miss the shot or they'll strike out. We called it the whammy. I don't know if you give them the whammy. Today they call it the stink eye, I think. But the evil eye is that parable's warning that if we assume that we are supposed to receive, if we assume we are the ones who are going to get more than others, envy is going to ensue. Hatred is going to ensue. Jealousy is going to ensue. And those are the destructive forces of humanity. Envy, hatred, jealousy. And the rabbis knew this. The rabbis made a tremendous midrash. I don't know if you know what a midrash is. A midrash is a story created by the rabbis to illustrate the teachings of God. And they created a story about the evil eye. And the story was that there was a shepherd who had a very small flock, but he was a righteous man. And God smiled upon him. And so God sent the angel Gabriel to be with him. And the angel said, "God has smiled upon you with his grace, and God is going to grant 3 wishes. You have 3 wishes, and God will grant them." And the shepherd was excited, and this is wonderful. Then the angel said, "But whatever is granted to you, double will be granted to your neighbor across the valley." And the shepherd thought, well, that's all right. What's your first wish? My first wish is for 100 sheep. He woke up the next morning and he looked out on his pasture and he had 100 sheep. And he was filled with joy and happiness, a feeling of wealth and well-being. And then he looked across the valley and his neighbor had 200 sheep. And he said to himself, well, that's all right. I can live with that. And then finally the next day came and the angel came and the angel said, "What is your second wish?" And the shepherd said, "I would like to live in a big house with 2 stories and stairwells and a pool out back and 2-car garage." The angel said, "So it shall be." And he woke up the next morning and he lived in a 2-story house with stairs going up and down and a pool in the back and a 2-car garage. And he was filled with joy. But then he looked across the valley. And his neighbor had a 4-story house with a 4-car garage and an Olympic swimming pool in the back. It was one of those Toll Brothers houses. Then it happened. Then his joy turned to envy. Then his joy turned to jealousy. And finally his joy turned to hate. And it came time for his 3rd wish. And Gabriel came down and said, "What is your 3rd wish?" And in his anger he said, "Cause me to be blind in one eye."